My name is Martin Maxwell. Originally, my name was Max Meisels, and my parents came from Poland, and they brought my older brother Leo, but I was born in Vienna. Okay, when I was about 6 years old, we moved into a new apartment that the city had built in the 10th district of Vienna. Vienna had a population of 2 million, but 180,000 were Jews. And most of the Jews lived in the 2nd district. Where we moved in, we were the only Jews in that big apartment building. And a lot of people had gathered to find out. And a little boy about my age, I became great friends with him afterwards because we both played soccer, said to me, "You don't look like Jews. You don't have any horns." I said, "I never knew that I was supposed to have horns." And he said, "Why are you moving into this small workers' apartment? All Jews have all the money in the world." I said, "Not all Jews. We don't have any money." Anyhow, we became great friends. They were next to us. Unfortunately, my father was not well already, and he had trouble working, so his parents, Ricky's parents, invited me often for dinner. And remember one day they gave me 5 Wiener Schnitzels on my plate. I said, "Mrs. Herman, I can't eat all that." She said, "You know, it's a sin to throw it away. You better take it home." In other words, she wanted to make sure we had something to eat. Okay, so I belonged to a synagogue, a small synagogue. I sang in a big choir in the temple, but when there was nothing doing there, I went to the small synagogue. And every Saturday, the hooligans came and smashed the windows, and the police looked the other way. So I joined something called Young Betar. I joined because they gave away free sandwiches. But I found out after a little while, when I told them my story about the synagogue, they said, "You know what we're going to do? One day, one Saturday, we're going to bring all the kids from the other small synagogue and we'll wait for them." And they did come, and we knocked the hell out of them. They didn't come back after that. So we were told at Young Betar, a very important person is going to come to Vienna. So we assembled in the Vienna woods, about 200 of us, and this man came and thanked us for joining Young Betar, and he said, "I promise you this, one day we will have a country of our own, but we will have to fight for it. Not only to get it, but even when we have it, we'll have to fight for it." And his name, Zev Jabotinsky. And this is the first time I heard Hatikva being sung. Now, what makes my character? People ask me often, what is it that makes you? I say 3 things make me. When I was 6 years old, my mother was in the corner knitting, and I was playing, and I fell down and I hurt my knee. And I said, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, my knee hurts." And she said to me, "Get up, come over here, and I will kiss it better." What did it teach me for life? That each one of us falls down. But that's not the important part. The important part is to get up and start again. The second one, I told you, that we Jews always have to defend ourselves. We cannot leave it to others. Now I'm coming to Christmas Eve, 1938. 1938, yes. It was a beautiful night outside, and I looked, the stars were out, the snow had stopped falling. I thought, I'll go for a walk to a neighborhood where the rich people lived. And I walked about half a mile or so and came to a beautiful, wonderful big house. and they had a fantastic picture window, and I could see there was a fireplace, a Christmas tree. They were sitting around the table, mother and father, and a daughter and a boy. I knew the boy because he also played soccer. And I wanted to have a closer look at the Christmas tree. So I stepped forward, but I hit a twig. And the twig hit the window. And the woman came out and she said, "Hey, little boy, what are you doing out there? It's freezing. Come on inside. I'll give you a hot chocolate and Christmas cake." So I went, and the little boy said, "Oh, Mommy, he's the Jewish boy who plays soccer." And they gave me a huge piece of cake, and I looked at it and said, "I wish I could take it home for my sisters." And she said to me, eat it, there's lots more." When I finished eating, she said to me, "Little boy, can I ask you, do your parents know that you are out alone and walking all this distance?" Being a young kid, I told her the whole story. I said, "My father's in the hospital, and my mother is always with him because the doctors told her he has terminal cancer and he won't live long. And we always stay up late because sometimes our mother brings food from the hospital." It was deathly quiet. And she said to her husband, "Come on with me." And she said to me, "Do you have brothers and sisters at home?" I said, "Yes, I have 3 sisters." She said, "What's their name?" I said, "Josephine, Erna, and Bertha. And I have a brother who's away in school." And then she said, "And what is the name of your mother?" I said, "Rachel." She disappeared. In about half an hour, they came out with 4 boxes, about that big. Each one had the name of my sisters and one mine, and she gave me an envelope that says Rachel on it. And she said, "My husband and son are going to drive you home in our truck because you can't carry it." So they drove us home. We went upstairs, and the kids were so excited to open. Every dream a kid would have was in there. Chocolate, nuts, little playthings, books, and even some money. They said, if you want to buy ice cream or want to buy more books. And she left. And my mother came in. She couldn't believe what she saw. She said, "Where did you get all this?" And we told her. And I said, "Mama, here is a letter for you." And she opened it, and I can still see her. She was actually crying. Tears were running down her face. And she read me the letter. "Dear Rachel, this is Christmas Eve, and we, the Hermans, have everything that we want. A big house. My husband has a wonderful job. We have a lot of money. My kids are healthy and doing well in school, and you have nothing. We want to share with you." And she looked at the envelope and she said to me, "I can't believe this. There's enough money in here for us to pay the rent and live for 9 months." My father died about 1.5 years later. My father died, and unfortunately my mother died 6 months later of pneumonia because they didn't have the drugs to cure them. So we all went to orphanages. I went to a very religious orphanage, and my 3 sisters went, and my brother went to the yeshiva. Hitler arrived in Austria in March 1938, and we were told that all Jewish institutions had to close, the orphanages had to close. Now the 3rd day after Hitler arrived, all the young men and the rabbis in the yeshiva were arrested, sent to concentration camp. And about the 4th or 5th day, it was raining, it was muddy. An SS officer threw his dirty boots at my brother and said, "Hey, little Jew, I want you to make these boots look like new when I come back." He must have done a good job, because he says, "From now on, you're going to look after me. You come into my cabin, you clean, and you make coffee and clean my belt and my boots." About 2 months later, he called him into the office and said, I'm being promoted to Obersturmbannführer the SS and being sent to Berlin. Here is a letter that says the following. I've examined this man's case. He's not an enemy of the state, and anything you can do to help him will be appreciated by me. Signed, Obersturmführer the SS, and he said, you're free to go. Now, what happened to me? I was called into the school, and the vice principal said, I'm sorry to tell you, this is your last day in school. I says, why? I says, I know you play soccer for the school, you collect stamps, you know every country, you're top of the class in many things, but I have no choice. No Jewish students or teachers are allowed. And I said, how about my graduation certificate? He says, I asked for it and they wouldn't give it to you. So here's a bar of chocolate, go and get the hell out of Austria, there's no future. So what happened? I went, the orphanage closed, and I went to Vienna. And a very nice family who knew my mother, gave us a room. How did we live, my brother and I? Well, for the Jews who could leave Vienna because they had money and people out there, they had to stand in line for their tax certificate. Sometimes they had to stand in line for 3 days and 3 nights. There were so many people. So what we did, my brother and I, at night, we took their places so they can go home to sleep, and they paid us. So not only did we have money, but we helped the people who gave us the room. Now we come to Crystal Night, November 8th, 9th, 1938. It was absolutely unbelievable. My brother and I tried to hide, but they came and dragged us out, and they marched us through the streets, and they spit on us, and they kicked us. And I saw this elderly man. He was the local Jewish doctor. I said, this is the man whom you called in the middle of the night because your kids or your parents were sick, and now you're kicking at him and spit at him. Anyhow, we all became in front of an SS officer. And he said, where are your parents? He said, they're dead. He said, go out that way, the left side. Everybody was going out that way. But my brother had the letter from the SS officer with him. So he showed it to him. Oh, he said, he's a wonderful person. No, you go out the right side. So, but we were scared because only 2 other people went out that way. As we left, the Hitler youth were there, and my brother says, Grüß Gott, God be with you. And they said, we don't have a God in Vienna. Hitler is our God. And it wasn't till the next day we found out that all the people that left by the west side, the left side, were deported to the border or sent to Poland. So we were lucky. Now what happened? The whole world knew what was going on. Did anybody care? Yes. There was a Christian organization in Vienna in England called the Quakers. And they persuaded the British government, with the help of Mr. Churchill, to let in 10,000 children from Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany. My brother and I were on there. But he had to make a decision what to do with the 3 little girls in the orphanage. They couldn't get on. He went to the orphanage and they said, we are fortunate. We have a small orphanage in Paris that's willing to take them. And my brother thought it was the safest place in the world, Paris. So he signed and they went to Paris. Now, we got on the train, the Kindertransport, on December the 31st, 1938. It was so awful. There were little kids there, 7 years old, and she looked after her 1-year-old sister. And she said, Mommy, Mommy, don't put me on the train. I'm going to be a good girl from now on. They thought of being sent away because they didn't behave. Anyhow, of the 10,000 children who went, 69% never saw their parents again. We went to, because it was Christmas holiday, we went to Dr. Schoenfeld's school in London, and the volunteers came and they served us food and held the kids who were crying. And one lady went home and said, "I'm so proud of myself. I placed 3 children today." What does it mean? She found homes. And her husband and her son, who was a little older than I, said, "Mother, that's wonderful. Why don't we take somebody?" And that wonderful family, Weber, Jewish family, took me and adopted me, sent me to school with their son in London. What a wonderful family. War broke out. We were in London. We lived there through the most terrible things, bombing every night. And everybody told the king and queen, "You should go for safety to Canada or Australia." And I remember them like yesterday, said, "No, we are going to stay with my people." I have such great admiration for them. I remember after a big air raid in the East End, they went there through the rubble, they shook people's hand and consoled them. My older brother joined the Air Force, and I tried to join, but they told me to go back to kindergarten. I was not even 17. Anyhow, I kept asking and asking. Finally, when I was 17 and a half, and one day they took me. But my stepmother had to sign that she gave me permission. So I went to a place called Liverpool, but because I was what is called an enemy alien, I could only join what is called the Pioneer Corps. In other words, work, dig ditches, trenches. But they found out one day that I played soccer for the school. So they asked me whether I'd like to play for the army. I said, sure. Anyhow, when I finished my training, I went to the sports officer and said, "Listen, I don't want to stay in the Pioneer Corps to dig trenches. I want to go to a fighting unit." So he said, "I'll do you a favor and I'll send you to the tank unit." And there I met a wonderful young Welsh boy. His name was Evan Williams. We became great friends. If there was something in the synagogue where they gave away food, I invited him. There was something in the church, I went with him. And then a call went out. They wanted volunteers for the glider pilot regiment. 800 people volunteered, but they only needed 60 pilots. So each one had to write exam, and a few of them already dropped out. But the worst part was in August, when it's over 90 degrees, we, in full uniform, carrying rifles or machine guns, we had to march 10 miles. After 2 or 3 miles, many people just fainted and dropped out. Only 70 survived. And Evan Williams and I were one of the 2. Now then we had to learn how to fly. We learned to fly on a little plane called Tiger Moth, a 2-seater plane, one for the instructor and one for the pupil. So as we went up, the pilot said to me, "Have you ever flown before?" I said, "No." I said, "Good, hold on." And he turned the plane upside down, and I was hanging by my straps, and he turned it sideways, that way, down and up. And after 5 minutes, he straightened out and he said to me, "Can I ask you a very personal question?" I said, "Yes, sir." "How is your underwear?" I said, "My underwear is still dry." I said, "Good, you'll make a wonderful pilot." Anyhow, we did a lot of training. And I want to take you now to June the 3rd, 1944. Our Lieutenant General Browning came in. We were all assembled. And he said, "Boys, this is it. That's what we've been waiting for. I don't have to remind you of the total destruction of Warsaw, of Rotterdam, of the firebombing of London, and other places to kill as many civilians as possible to break our spirits. They haven't done it. It's our turn. But because you will be the first ones in. Each glider had 2 pilots, and the first 6 gliders were going to go in before anybody else. So I was one of the pilots of one of those gliders, and he pointed to us, because you were the first ones in, many of you will not return. So here is a chance. There's paper, pens, and envelopes to write to your parents, your fiancés, and your friends, maybe your last letter. It became very quiet. I wrote to the parents, the people who adopted me, thanking them for giving me a new chance in life. I wrote to my stepbrother, who joined the Air Force. The letter found him in Burma, in the jungles. I wrote to my own brother Leo, who had joined the American Air Force as a bombardier, and over the oil fields of Ploiești in Romania, his plane was hit, but he and 2 young Irish boys were managed to parachute down before the plane blew up. The Germans captured him, but Marshal Tito raided the camp and he freed them, and he finished his tour in duty. And he and one of the Irish boys, who was not Jewish, in 1948 went to Palestine to help to create the State of Israel. Unfortunately, he died quite young. Now my 3 sisters, I wrote to them. What happened to them? There's a terrible movie out, it's called The Roundup, that shows what happened in Paris in 1942. The men had already gone, there's just women and children left. And the French police and the Germans dragged these women and children out and put them in trucks and put them in trains. They took my sister Josephine first, and a few days later Erna, and my little sister Bertha, the baby, ran after the truck and said, I want to go with my sister. They kicked her off and said, you're not on the list, you'll be next. She sat on the pavement and cried. But it was a Sunday, and the family Strobel had just come from church, who had 2 children, Francois and Gerard, 4 and 6 years old. And he said to his parents and brother, we cannot save them all, but how about if we save one? So they went to the orphanage, and they picked my sister Bertha, and they took her, they made her wear a cross, and they went to a church with her. He worked as an auto mechanic, and one day he repaired a high-ranking SS man's car, and he said, Mr. Strobel, I understand you have a young girl looking after your 2 children, referring to my sister. He knew, of course, that she was Jewish, because he said to him, if you ever have any trouble, here is my card, you can phone me. So even amongst the worst, there's somebody who has a little feeling. I did not know actually what happened to my 2 sisters. I knew they died until 3 years ago. I was invited to Prince Edward Island, and I was interviewed on TV and said, Mr. Maxwell is here to speak to the veterans and to the military, but on Sunday he'll be speaking at a church, and everybody is welcome. Now, the lady who arranged my trip told me that a few months before, she and a friend went to Auschwitz. She was so moved, and she told me that she met an old lady who was there with her granddaughter, and he started talking to her. And the old lady said, I was so lucky that day. I was called to peel potatoes and carrots in the kitchen. But in the morning, the loudspeakers came on, the music came on, He said, children, get dressed and take your toys with you. You're going to have a bath, nice warm bath. And there they marched, these children, laughing and grinning and joking. And when they came to the bath, they said, children, get undressed. Fold your clothes nicely and put your toys on top so you will recognize it when they came out. Of course, they never came out. And I personally looked up and see most of the women crying. And she continued saying, how is it possible that the most educated nation in Europe can lead rabbis, priests, women, so many children to their death while joking and laughing? May their souls rot in hell forever, and may we never forget, so it would never happen again. That's how I learned how my two sisters died. Anyhow, when we finished all this, we shook hands to our friends, and on June the 5th, the night before D-Day, the 6 gliders took off. We were to go to Normandy and capture Pegasus Bridge. I have pictures of all that. So to stop the Germans from bringing reinforcements from the back. There's just a couple of problems we encountered, we were told. There are guards on the bridge, about 12, and 12 stand by in reserve. We couldn't use our guns. Otherwise, we would wake up all the German garrisons half a mile away. We had to use knives and bayonets. So can you imagine what it was like for an 18-year-old to murder somebody with knives and bayonets? But we did. It lasted maybe for 20 minutes. We lost some of our people, but we killed them. Then we went to the garrisons, had another big fight. We lost half our people, but we killed every one of them, except one. That one recently wrote a book and said, how I was liberated by the British. He had hidden himself in the garbage, in a garbage truck. Anyhow, we saw the whole invasion. Unbelievable. Thousands of planes and ships, and it was unbelievable to see that. In 3 days, they linked up with us, and we were evacuated back to England. While I was training, I always had my ears glued to the radio. I followed the fight in Russia, and I will never forget listening to the courageous fight in Stalingrad. I think it was one of the big turning points of the war, because finally the Germans were defeated and General Paulus had to surrender. There was such celebration when that happened. And I met a man about a year and a half ago who fought in Stalingrad, and I shook his hand and I said, thank you for everything you have done. You changed everything for us. Anyhow, as we were being evacuated to the beaches, we saw horrible sights. So many dead and wounded. And we came to the beaches where a group of dead people were lying, but further over, there was one single young man. He looked like a kid. His helmet had fallen off. He had red hair. It looked like he was asleep, except he had a bullet hole through his head. And I thought, in years to come, will we remember that you never had a chance to live? Will we remember and thank you for what you did? We came back to England, but General Montgomery has decided he wanted to finish the war by December 1944. So he was going to send 30,000 airborne troops to Holland. Now there was a young officer who flew reconnaissance over a place called Arnhem. That's where we were supposed to land. And he came back and he told General Montgomery, sir, there's a German tank division there. You should not send the people to Arnhem because they're going to be slaughtered. And General Montgomery said to him, you have not been feeling well, and I'm sending you home on sick leave. He didn't want this man to tell others what he saw. And on September the 17th, 1944, carrying in my glider high-ranking Polish officers, because a Polish brigade had joined us, we landed just outside Arnhem. I cannot tell you the joy and the excitement of the Dutch people. They hugged and kissed us. They brought out drinks they'd saved for 5 years. It was just unbelievable. But the next day, reality set in. The tanks had moved in. They shot down many of the planes that came, including the gliders, and we fought and fought. We finally, eventually got to one part of the bridge. Couldn't get any further. Our general had asked Montgomery how long before the tanks from Nijmegen could reach us. He said 2 days. He said, we cannot last more than 3 days. Perhaps this is a bridge too far. And from that came the famous movie called A Bridge Too Far. The 4th or 5th day, the Germans bombarded us with tanks and mortars. People were dying and screaming. We had no medicine. We had no food. But the Dutch men and women tried, even children tried to bring us water. When the Germans saw them, they shot them right there. The last 2 or 3 days, we peed green. You know why? Because we ate grass. There was nothing to eat. And people were screaming for pain. There's no medicine. Anyhow, one of the officers said to me, Maxwell, you're the fittest. Go over to Hotel Hartenstein and find out. We have no communications. We have no food, no medicine. What's going to happen? So I jumped out of the trench. I had gone maybe 15 to 20 feet when a huge bombardment of tanks and mortars hit behind me. I was told killing everybody. I was lifted up in the air, turned around, and smashed against a tree. When I woke up, I heard somebody screaming. I was the one screaming. My right hand was broken in half. My thigh was sticking out here, and I became unconscious. And then I woke up and I heard somebody whisper, hey, this kid may still be alive. So they pushed me up, they bandaged my arm, gave me some pills they had, pushed back my side here, and they half carried and dragged me towards a makeshift hospital that had a Red Cross on it. But the Germans were still firing the snipers. And as I was being dragged along, a young man handed me a picture and said, I know I will not make it. This is the photograph of my family, and her phone number is in the back. Will you please tell them I love them and I thought of them? He died a few minutes later. And I was put down next to a man who had lost part of his left leg. And he said to me, hey kid, don't you go to sleep, because if you do, you'll never wake up. So I said to him, listen, it's stupid for us to be here. You're going to kill us anyhow. Why don't you and I take a chance and we will go and crawl towards the German lines? What's the worst that can happen? They're going to kill us. We're going to die anyhow. So he agreed. And we started to crawl to the German lines. Unbeknownst to us, an armistice had been arranged for 6 hours. So they picked us up, put us in a truck, and drove us through Arnhem towards the hospital. What a horrible sight, I cannot believe. As we go into Arnhem, dozens and dozens of Dutch men and women, yes, and children, were hanging by their necks from wires strung across the street. Their faces already black. The Germans wouldn't let them out. and they had signs on them. That happens to collaborators and traitors. I got to the hospital. It took a doctor 3 days to get to me. And then they picked 60 of us to be interviewed by the SS in Apeldoorn. We were there, and they started to talk to us. And then one night, 2 SS officers came, and one said to the other one, "Tomorrow night we're going to kill the bastards." So the other one said, "Are you crazy? In 6 months they'll be in Berlin, and you'll be a war criminal, and they will hunt you and your family." So anyhow, a few days later, they put us on the train to Hanover, to the prisoner war camp. Supposed to take 7 to 9 hours. It took 3 days. Why? Because our own Air Force was bombing the tracks. They actually bombed them 6 times. So it took us 3 days. Years later, I was speaking to Canadian, American, and British Air Force officers, and I said to them, "How is it possible that you bombed the tracks to Hanover 6 times? How is it you never bombed the tracks to Auschwitz even once?" It was deathly quiet. But afterwards, a British and an American officer came to me and said, "The reason we didn't bomb is because we were told not to do it." The advisors to Churchill and Roosevelt said, "What's the point of rescuing the Jews? Nobody wants them. What are we going to do with them?" Anyhow, we arrived at the camp. Next door to us was a Russian camp. And they wouldn't let us into the camp. We couldn't understand why. But we found out. It was 12:30, and they were giving away the bread ration for the day. They wanted us to miss it. So when the Russian prisoners saw what was happening, they threw their own bread over to us. They knew we hadn't eaten anything in 2 or 3 days. The way they treated those Russian prisoners, they should each one of them be shot. There was a big fat German with 2 dogs. He said, "Every day I'm going to get myself a Russian." What did he mean? He picked somebody out and let the dogs on him. So one day, the Russians found a piece of wood. They made it into a knife, and they killed the dog. So the Germans took 50 Russians and executed them. Even when the air raids were on, they sent these poor Russians out to clean the streets. 50 went out, 20 came back. They were so horrible with them. Anyhow, on May the 1st, I don't want to tell you what's happening in the camp. It's too horrible. On May the 1st, a British tank came into our camp, and we were liberated. 2 days later, my friend and I were standing outside the camp, and 2 Russian officers, each came in a separate jeep. They looked at my watch, and I said, "I want your navigation watch." I said, "What will you give me for it?" "How about the jeep, 6 cans of petrol, so you can have it." So we made a deal. I forgot to tell you, when we were liberated, the Russians were told this: "You can go into town for 24 hours and do the hell what you want. Anything, everything you want. But you got to be back here in 24 hours, otherwise we come and get you." And they did. I don't want to tell you what they did. They did what they wanted to do. Anyhow, we took the jeep and put some food in it and drinks. We came to a crossroads. On the left, Bergen-Belsen, on the right, Kinderheim. We decided to go to the Kinderheim, children's home. About a mile and a half became a barbed wire enclosed camp. It was the most horrible sight I've ever seen. Dozens and dozens of children lying there dead and dying, and the wild dogs were eating them. We sounded our horns on the jeep, and they ran away, and a little girl came over and put her arms around my friend's legs and said, "Papa, Papa." And a woman came out and said, "She's a Polish girl. Her father died in the army, and every soldier looks to her like it's her father." She said, I have 270 girls and boys here, no food, no water, 10% die every day. Can you help us? We promised we would come back the next day with anything. We borrowed, we stole. On the way, I saw a big doll in the window of a little store. I offered him some cigarettes and he gave me the doll, and we went back. The kids were yelling. They gave him food and whatever. And I had the doll and I wanted to give it to little Hannah. And I was walking towards the house and the woman came and she shook her head and she said, little Hannah died in the night. Her last words were, Papa, Papa. We went back to England and I was sent to interview and interrogate German prisoners of war because many of them, of the high-ranking officers, were hiding in private uniform, okay? So I did that, but then we were sent to Washington, D.C., to the Pentagon for the trial of General Rundstedt, who issued an order that says, if you capture those with the green berets, the commandos, or the red berets, the airborne division, shoot them, do not take them prisoner. During my stay in Washington, D.C., I knew that President Truman took a walk every day. So one day I stood in my uniform and I tried to take a picture. The Secret Service grabbed my hand and said, you can't do that. But President Truman came over to me and said, what are you doing in Washington? It was my uniform, I told him. And I noticed you're a glider pilot. What did you do? I told him. He shook my hand and said, thank you. And 2 weeks later, I was invited to his inauguration parade, and I sat maybe 50 feet beside him. Anyhow, we worked for 2 years on Rundstedt. We had him. What happened? The Berlin blockade. And the Americans and the British thought they may need the Germans to fight the Russians, so they announced the following. General Rundstedt, at the age of 65, is too old and too sick to be tried. So we wasted 2 years. Anyhow, I eventually came to Canada because we found a well-known relative in Toronto. His name was Meisels. He was a distant relative, and he brought my sister over, and I came here. Now, I didn't want to talk about the war. I didn't want to talk about anything. But I joined an organization called Christian-Jewish Dialogue. And one day, about 28 years ago, Reverend Nelson called me. And he said, would you do me a favor? I know your story. I have a church full of people, but the Holocaust survivor is sick and he couldn't come. Would you please come? So somebody drove me, and I was so amazed how interested they were. So I started speaking all over the place. You know, I spoke in high schools, Upper Canada. I spoke in the best schools, the most wonderful schools. Now, one day I spoke in the York school, and I told them the story about me being kicked out of school. 2 weeks later, I had a call from the principal. They said, all the students and all the teachers have signed a petition that we should give you a special high school graduation certificate. I have the newspapers in there and the pictures that says 85-year-old finally graduates high school. So that's it. But I got involved in the Holocaust Center, and I spoke to so many different, but also we went back to Holland to celebrate the 60th anniversary of their liberation. 14,000 of us went that many years ago. 5 years later, it was just 1,300. And in 2016, it was just 70 of us. I cannot tell you the love of the Dutch. 70 of us were there. 250,000 people lined the streets to thank us what we did so many years ago. A little boy was, I was in the front Jeep, a little boy was held up and said something in Dutch. And I said to the father, what did he say? He says, when I grow up, I'm going to be a soldier like you and defend my country. Further on, a little girl stopped and gave me some flowers and gave me a letter. And she shook my hand and left. Beautiful young girl. And the television and radio people were beside me and said, can we find out what's in the letter? So I opened the letter and she said this, so many years ago you came and fought and you saved my Oma. She was sick and you gave her medicine. She was hungry and you gave her food. We, the Dutch people, were dying of hunger and you dropped food from your aeroplane. That's why I'm here today, to shake your hands and say thank you. And this was played and replayed on Dutch television and radio for the whole day. Anyhow, the last day when we were there, okay, it was just the 70 of us. And they spoke to us and thanked us. And then the Queen left, and we followed the Queen out. And they all stood up and they sang the most fantastic song from the war. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. And let me tell you, both sides had tears in their eyes because they knew we wouldn't make the next 5 years. Now, the Queen had a special meeting just with the veterans. Not even my wife could come, or the kid, because a few years ago there was an attack on the royal family. And as she saw me come in, she said, I am so pleased to see you, Mr. Maxwell. Would you please come over here so we can take a photograph taken, which I have in there. And she said, I remember every word that you said when you spoke to us last. 10,000 were in the arena and the whole royal family. 10,000 young people who come from all over Europe and North America. And you said to them, there are so few of us left. That's why I'm handing over the torch of freedom from my generation to yours. Hold it high so others can see how precious it is. And if ever you have to fight for it, do it with everything you have, because once it is lost, it's almost impossible to get back. It took us, the Allies, 5 years with millions and millions and millions of dead and wounded to give you, Dutch and others, your freedom. Now, I want to recall one more item that I did as I visited so many cemeteries. The pictures are out there. I came across one, a young boy who came from me from Vienna. He fought on D-Day, but he died at Arnhem, and I put a stone on there. And then I visited the American cemetery. It was the 70th anniversary of their liberation, and the Dutch children had put American flags on each of the graves and the word thank you beside it. And written on one of the graves, I found the following words: for your tomorrows, we gave our todays. And I looked at it and I thought, if these young men had a chance to get up and look at our world today, so full of hatred, people don't stand up for the national anthem. They hate everybody. I know what they would say. What the hell have you done with the tomorrows we gave you? Now, when I finish speaking, especially to a Jewish audience, I always finish the following. I have a recording at home that goes like this. I'm a BBC reporter, British Broadcasting Corporation, and I'm here at Bergen-Belsen, the infamous concentration camp. The second day of their liberation, thousands and thousands of dead have been taken away and they're still dying. But with me are 20 survivors. They could hardly stand, men and women and 2 children. And I told them who I am, that I'm going to record what they have to say. And I say to them, do you have a message for the world? A message for the world, yes. First of all, to those who tortured and beat you and killed everything that was dear to you. And then to the millions of others who turned the other way and very often took part because they wanted your possessions or your apartment. Yes, and even to Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt, who knew in 1942 what was going on because people had escaped and showed them. But the advisor told them, don't bother. What would we do with the Jews if we rescued them? And what is this message that you want to send, which I will record? And with all the strength they had left, they gathered round the microphone and they yelled into it, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live and will live. Thank you.